Lincoln High School's gymnasium was packed with teenagers on a bright Friday afternoon. The Marine Corps recruiting team had set up an impressive display. There were pull-up bars for fitness challenges, a combat simulator with VR headsets, tables covered with glossy brochures showing Marines in dress blues and combat gear, a massive banner hung from the basketball hoop reading "The Few, the Proud, the Marines." Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison stood at the center of it all, his uniform immaculate, his bearing confident. At 28, he was the top recruiter in his district. He had a gift for connecting with high school kids, for making the Marine Corps sound like the adventure of a lifetime, which he believed it was. His team consisted of Sergeant Chen and Corporal Davis, both young and enthusiastic, both skilled at drawing crowds and getting signatures on interest forms. This event had been planned for months. The school had given them the entire afternoon. Parents were invited, local media was present. This was their showcase event. Everything was going perfectly until the old man showed up. He walked into the gym alone, moving slowly with a noticeable limp. He was maybe 75, thin, wearing worn jeans and a faded Marines t-shirt that looked like it had been washed 1,000 times. His face was weathered, deeply lined, and his gray hair was cut high and tight, in a style that hadn't changed since the 1970s. Morrison noticed him immediately, but didn't think much of it. Probably a veteran who wanted to see what modern recruiting looked like. Maybe he'd share some stories, add authenticity to the event. That could actually be helpful. But the old man didn't come to the recruiting tables. He walked straight to where a group of teenage boys were clustered around the combat simulator, waiting their turn. He stood there, watching, listening to Morrison's pitch about defending freedom and earning the title of Marine. Then the old man spoke. His voice was quiet but carried clearly in the gymnasium. He asked the boys if they understood what they were really signing up for. Morrison's head snapped around. He walked over with a professional smile fixed on his face. He greeted the old man and thanked him for his service, then suggested he might want to check out the display tables while the team worked with the students. The old man ignored him. He was looking at the boys, his pale gray eyes moving from face to face. He asked them again if they knew what combat actually meant. Not the video game version, the real thing. Had anyone explained to them what it felt like to watch your friend bleed out because the medevac couldn't reach you in time? The boys shifted uncomfortably. The energy Morrison had built up was draining away. Morrison's smile tightened. He said respectfully that they appreciated the veterans' concern, but they were conducting an official recruiting event. If he had questions, he could speak to Morrison privately. The old man finally looked at Morrison. He said he didn't have questions. He had answers. And these kids needed to hear them before they signed anything. Morrison felt his patience snap. He'd dealt with protesters before, usually peace activists or anti-war groups. But an old veteran trying to sabotage a recruiting event was something new and particularly offensive. He told the old man firmly that he needed to step back. This was Marine Corps business. If he was trying to discourage recruitment, he needed to leave. The old man said he wasn't trying to discourage anyone. He was trying to make sure they understood what they were choosing. There was a difference between recruitment and preparation. Sergeant Chen had noticed the confrontation and walked over. She asked quietly if there was a problem. Morrison said there might be. He asked the old man one more time to please step away from the students. But the old man had turned back to the boys. He pointed at one kid, a tall, athletic teenager wearing a football jersey. He asked the boy why he wanted to join. The kid said he wanted to serve his country, and the Marines were the best. The old man nodded. He asked if the boy had ever been in a real fight. Not on a football field, a real fight where someone was trying to kill him. The boy said no, but he was tough. He could handle it. The old man's expression was sad. He said toughness wasn't the same as readiness. He asked if the boy had ever seen someone die, if he'd ever had to make a decision that would determine whether his friends lived or not, if he'd ever felt the weight of knowing that a mistake, just one small mistake, could end multiple lives. The gymnasium had gotten quieter. Other students and parents were listening now. Morrison could feel his carefully constructed event falling apart. He stepped between the old man and the students. He said, "That was enough." The Marine Corps had trained professionals to discuss these topics appropriately. This man was being disruptive and inappropriate. He needed to leave now, or Morrison would call security. The old man said Morrison didn't understand what he was doing. He was selling them a commercial, not preparing them for reality. Morrison felt anger flash hot in his chest. He'd served 2 tours. He'd seen combat. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he didn't need some bitter old veteran who probably hadn't worn the uniform in decades telling him how to do his job. He told Chen to call school security. This individual was disrupting an official Marine Corps event. The old man didn't leave. He stood his ground and said these boys deserved the truth, not a sales pitch. The Marines needed warriors, not kids who thought combat was like a video game. Morrison made a decision. He stepped closer and spoke in a low, hard voice. He told the old man that if he didn't leave immediately, Morrison would personally ensure he was charged with interfering with military recruitment. That was a federal offense. The old man's eyes hardened. He asked Morrison what his combat experience was. Morrison said that was none of his concern. But the old man persisted. He asked what engagements Morrison had been in, where he'd served, what he'd actually seen. Morrison said he'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan. He'd seen plenty, more than enough. The old man asked what Morrison's MOS was, his military occupational specialty. Morrison said he'd been an admin specialist, but that didn't make his service any less valid. The Marines needed all roles to function. The old man said nothing, just looked at him with those gray eyes that seemed to see right through him. School security arrived. 2 guards who looked uncomfortable with the situation. Morrison explained that this individual was disrupting their event and needed to be escorted from the premises. The guards approached the old man. One of them, an older guard named Thompson, seemed to recognize something. He asked the old man for his name. The old man said his name was Daniel Cross. Thompson went pale. He asked if he meant Sergeant Major Daniel Cross, the Medal of Honor recipient. Morrison felt his stomach drop. The old man just nodded. Thompson stepped back immediately. He told his partner they weren't removing this man. They couldn't. He turned to Morrison and said, "Did he have any idea who he was threatening?" Morrison stammered that he didn't know. The man hadn't identified himself. He was interfering with recruitment. By now, several parents had pulled out their phones. A quick search for Daniel Cross and Medal of Honor brought up pages of results. The story spread through the gymnasium in whispers. Sergeant Major Daniel Cross, Fallujah, 2004. His unit ambushed. He'd single-handedly held a position for 4 hours while his Marines extracted wounded. He'd been hit 3 times, refused evacuation until every Marine was accounted for, saved 23 lives. Medal of Honor, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, the most decorated enlisted Marine of the Iraq War. One of the parents, a middle-aged woman, approached Morrison. She asked if he'd seriously just threatened to have a Medal of Honor recipient arrested for trying to give her son honest information about military service. Morrison felt the situation spiraling out of control. He said with respect, he was following protocol. Unauthorized individuals weren't permitted to interact with potential recruits during official events. A voice cut across the gymnasium, deep, authoritative, and absolutely furious. It asked what the hell was going on here. Everyone turned. A Marine officer had entered the gym, a colonel, his uniform displaying an intimidating array of ribbons. His face was set in lines of cold anger. This was Colonel Marcus Webb, commanding officer of the recruiting district. He'd been scheduled to make a brief appearance at the end of the event. He'd arrived early. Morrison snapped to attention, his heart hammering. He reported that they'd had an incident with an unauthorized individual interfering with the recruitment event. The situation was being handled. Colonel Webb ignored Morrison. He walked straight to Daniel Cross. The entire gymnasium watched as the colonel stopped in front of the old man, came to attention, and rendered the sharpest salute anyone there had ever seen. Webb said it was an honor to see the sergeant major again. It had been too long. Cross returned the salute slowly, almost reluctantly. He said the colonel looked well. Command clearly agreed with him. Webb said he owed his command, his career, and his life to the man standing in front of him. Cross had been his platoon sergeant in Fallujah. The ambush that earned Cross the Medal of Honor had been when he'd saved Webb and 22 other Marines. Webb turned to face Morrison and his team. His voice was no longer warm. He asked what exactly had happened here. Morrison tried to explain. He said the sergeant major had been approaching students and making statements that were discouraging recruitment. He'd refused to identify himself or leave when asked. Morrison had been trying to protect the integrity of the event. Webb asked Cross if that was accurate. Cross said he'd been trying to make sure the kids understood what they were signing up for. He'd spent too many years watching young Marines arrive in combat zones unprepared for the reality, kids who thought it would be like the commercials, kids who broke when they faced actual war. Webb asked what specifically Cross had said to the students. Cross said he'd asked them if they understood what combat really meant, if they'd thought about the responsibility, if anyone had explained that the brotherhood they'd be joining came with a cost, that the title of Marine was earned in blood and sacrifice, not handed out with a signing bonus. Webb was quiet for a long moment. Then he addressed the entire gymnasium. He said Sergeant Major Cross was absolutely right. The Marine Corps needed warriors, but warriors needed to be forged, not recruited with false expectations. He turned to Morrison. He said the staff sergeant's job was to find qualified candidates, but qualification wasn't just about physical fitness and test scores. It was about mental preparation, understanding, commitment to something bigger than adventure or benefits or escape from a small town. Morrison tried to defend himself. He said they followed all regulations. They were honest about the challenges. They didn't lie to recruits. Webb said not lying wasn't the same as telling the truth. There was a difference between presenting information and ensuring understanding. Cross spoke up. He said he wasn't trying to stop recruitment. The Marines needed good people, but he'd watched too many kids break because they weren't ready, because someone had sold them a dream without preparing them for the nightmare. He'd held too many dying 19-year-olds who whispered that they didn't know it would be like this. His voice cracked slightly. His hands, weathered and scarred, trembled. He said he came to these events because he still felt responsible for every kid who joined without understanding, for every family who got a flag and a promise that their child had died a hero, without being told that their child had been terrified and calling for home at the end. The gymnasium was dead silent. Several parents were crying. The teenagers who'd been so excited about the combat simulator and the pull-up challenges now looked uncertain, scared, and somehow older. Webb asked Cross if he would be willing to speak to the students, officially, to share his experience and his perspective. Cross hesitated, then he nodded. For the next hour, Daniel Cross talked. He didn't discourage the students from joining. He told them it was the greatest honor of his life to be a Marine, but he explained what that honor cost. He described Fallujah not in glorified terms, but in honest ones. The fear, The chaos, the impossibly hard choices, the brothers he'd lost, the weight he still carried. He told them that if they chose to join, they needed to go in with eyes open. They needed to be mentally prepared. They needed to understand that the commercials and the video games and the movies were lies. Combat was ugly and brutal, and it changed you forever. But if they were willing to accept that, if they were ready to serve despite the cost, not because of the benefits, then the Marines needed them, and he'd be proud to call them brothers and sisters. When he finished, the room was transformed. Some students had quietly left, realizing they weren't ready. Others stood taller, their decision now informed by truth rather than fantasy. Parents approached Cross to shake his hand, to thank him for his honesty. Morrison stood off to the side, humbled and ashamed. He'd been so focused on meeting his recruitment numbers that he'd forgotten the weight of what he was asking these kids to do. Cross approached him. Morrison expected anger. Instead, Cross extended his hand. Cross said Morrison was doing an important job. Recruitment mattered, but preparation mattered more. He asked if Morrison would consider adding a veteran perspective to future events. Not to discourage, but to educate. Morrison shook his hand and said he would be honored, and he was sorry for how he'd handled the situation. Cross said he understood. Morrison had been protecting his mission. That was what Marines did. He just needed to expand his definition of what that mission was. 3 months later, the recruiting district implemented a new program. Every recruitment event included a veteran speaker, someone with combat experience who could provide honest perspective. Daniel Cross led the training for these speakers, teaching them how to inform without discouraging, how to prepare without terrifying. And Morrison, humbled but wiser, became one of his best students. His recruitment numbers didn't suffer. If anything, they improved. Because the candidates who signed up now were doing so with full understanding, and they arrived at basic training mentally prepared for what was ahead. Sometimes the most important service you can provide isn't recruitment, it's honesty. It's making sure that the next generation of warriors understands what they're choosing before they make that choice, because the title of Marine is sacred, and it should never be earned by someone who didn't know what they were signing up for. Daniel Cross's story reminds us that true leadership isn't about numbers or quotas. It's about protecting those who will serve, even when that means telling them hard truths they might not want to hear. If this story moved you, like this video and share it with someone who needs to understand the real cost of service. Subscribe to Valor Chronicles for more stories of the heroes who continue to serve, even when the uniform comes off. Tell us in the comments about a veteran who gave you honest advice that changed your perspective. These voices matter. This truth matters.